Hi, everybody. This is Rob Doggett from the International Yeats Society and State University of New York at Geneseo, and we're doing another Yeats conversation. So this will be a lot of fun. I'm here with Matthew DeForrest. Good to see you, Matt. How you doing?
Doing all right. How are you?
Good. Thanks for meeting up with me. We're both at the end of our semester, so we're both busy time. So I really appreciate you uh, coming in and talking with me. Now, you're interim director of the Edward Z. Crutchfield Center for Integrated Studies and professor of English at Johnson C. Smith University. And people on here will know your work, Yeats and the Stylistic Arrangements of Experience. That book came out in I think it was late 90s. And you're doing a lot of work on, I know your own work, your work too, and a lot of articles on a vision. So what are you doing right now in your own research?
So these days, I've got two things, one of which applies to the poem today, one of which probably doesn't. I've got a long-term project where I'm trying to puzzle through the way Yeats conceived of time and how that influences his poetry, going all the way back to time in the, I'm going to blow the title now, Time in the Witch Vivian, one of his early plays, all the way up through kind of the end, and the way that, most poets are going to use time as kind of the time's winged chariot approach, conceptual progression of time and things like that. Yeats has a much more complex view of time, probably coming out of Blake, with concepts of eternity and his research on and beliefs in Eastern mysticism and things like that, where time is cyclical rather than the straight arrow of time.
Yeah, Nietzsche
So how
as
that
well.
plays out through the poems.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah,
say Nietzsche
and
as well.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well,
Um,
that's fascinating.
yeah, it's been an interesting run, and I've got to start getting that down on paper a little bit more.
Yeah.
But the second one that kind of applies a little bit today, I've got this niggling feeling that a number of the alchemists that Yeats read about and studied for years are kind of lurking in the background of a vision, not necessarily directly, but as kind of inspirational figures and topics, whether it's John Dee or the Flamels or Lully, as we'll have here in today's poetry, and how he is trying to situate himself within that tradition of the sort of true, sort of not books, and if you're into the magical traditions, what do you mean when you say that this is a true source? Um, it doesn't matter if they've made up some of the names. That doesn't necessarily discount the truth of what's in the text. So whether Christian Rosencrantz or all of those figures, whether they are real or not, somehow doesn't matter. It's the ideas in it and how those eventually become part of the source material for the speculum, and other kind of quasi-real, quasi-fake stories that he indulges in fully in a vision when he creates that and says, "Oh yeah, this comes from an ancient book that doesn't exist. I'm making this entire thing up because my wife doesn't want to go public with it." So it's that one I think is going to take a little bit more work to puzzle out.
That sounds complicated. That is, you're in the mysticism and vision area that I am not an expert at all in that aspect of Yeats. So I just love reading about those kind of magical texts beyond a lot of the work on a vision. You sort of, when you're doing Yeats studies, especially for people who are teaching, you sort of encounter some of the works that help you with a vision, and you get to the system and things like that, and you're like, okay, kind of got some basic understanding here, but as soon as you get into anything past that, you go down a rabbit hole. And I find that with the alchemy stuff, a lot of his earlier work with the Rosicrucian sort of tradition of the Golden Dawn stuff. Like, wow, there's a whole really complicated history of magic there that I don't know much about. So that sounds like a great project.
Yeah, it's an acquired taste, to say the least.
Yeah, yes. Now we're talking today about No Second Troy, the poem from the Green Helmet. It's a poem I think a lot of people will know. One of the later Maud Gunn kind of poems with the whole Helen of Troy business. Gets anthologized sometimes, I think. So why did you decide on this one? You could have picked any poem if you went with this.
I keep coming back to this poem because of the way that Yeats controls the reader,
Mhm.
with his use of enjambment and caesura to really not force the reader into something, but to um, control and continually undermine what it is that he's saying, um, in a way that kind of forces the reader through this surprise. And it's just this little beautiful ticking clock of a poem,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
that you desperately don't want to take apart because then it ceases to work.
Mhm. Mhm.
But just kind of watch it and watch it tick.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I keep coming back to it for that reason. It's probably my second favorite of Yeats's poetry, the first being When You Were Old,
Year old.
which someone else grabbed, but I probably shouldn't be the one to talk about that anyway. Uh,
Well, then I like the idea. I like what you're talking about here with this poem, and I'll have you read it in a second. But that control and undermining, and I think talking about something I'm really have been interested in with Yates lately is the way in which he's so good at generating a range of effects with people and reader. And also really like the idea here of the kind of clockwork. If you do take it apart, there are moments in this poem that you start taking it apart and you're like, there's a bit of sleight of hand to use a sort of magical idea here in some of what Yates is doing. So be interested to hear what you have to say about that. So let me share the screen.
okay.
And if I can do this correctly. All right, there we go. All right, we have the poem.
Okay. And one note for I spent some time listening to Yeats's recording of modern poetry just yesterday to confirm this one point. Um, my whatever version of a U.S. accent I've got right now, um, kind of American South through New York and Boston. Um, for Yeats, all the rhymes are exact in a way that it may not come across when I read the poem. Um, so here we are, No Second Troy. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a Titan bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why, what she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn?
Hmm. Yeah, fantastic poem, and definitely one of those that sparks what I think is sparks is an interesting metaphor there. That generates this sense of contemplation where we sort of inhabit a bit of mystery at the end of this poem, wondering it's sort of like what just happened there. I often have that effect with a lot of Yeats poems. So maybe take us through it then. Obviously, he's talking about everybody knows he's talking about Maud Gunn making the Helen of Troy comparison, but um the opening, really interesting opening with that question, that long question.
Yeah, I know one of the amazing things about this poem is that it's a series of questions.
Hmm.
And it's really easy to lose that as you're reading through it because the first three are in some ways rhetorical questions.
Hmm.
And if you had switched those question marks to periods, I'm not sure anyone would have noticed.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
but it is this. absolutely fantastic rhetorical stance as he's trying to puzzle through to get into the biography of it just a little bit. He's come back from Paris after what was probably the physical consummation of a relationship with Maud Gunn. And she has already, as he was leaving, started trying to distance herself from that and go back to the idea of, no, this is going to be a mystical marriage. And it's non-physical. Um, and he's got this cycle of poems at the beginning of the book. The first 8, he said, looking down at his notes, where he's wrestling with this, and puts them under the initial category of Lully to his wife Prunella, messing up the alchemist, because it's Nicholas Flamel and his wife, who are supposed to have in Paris come across the elixir of life, taken it together, and then moved off to the Far East to be together. Or not the Far East, the Middle East, kind of in an echo of what's going to come in the future. And we could, just as a quick taste, you get a lot of echoes forward in this poem and in the structure of the poem, where you're going to see what's going to come together more fully in the future with the vision and the constructions around it. So in the final cycle of that poem, you end up with a nod towards the rough beast, here in the way that you get this poem arranged in memoirs at the start of his journal. It's sitting there kind of like Leda and the Swan is in a vision. So there, and of course, in the entire story, well, the Flamels go into the Middle East and kind of come back as Kusta Ben Luca in those future poems. But he's kind of wrestling with, what is it that it's going to mean if this woman who he believes at the time is the love of his life and he aren't going to be physical, and he would really like it if it was. How is it that he's going to negotiate that, and how is it he's going to deal with that? And some of that creeps into this poem, because you get in this entire setting, and one of the earlier poems in the cycle, A Woman Homer Sung, Yeats never casts himself as any of the figures who are going to be physically intimate with Helen. He's not Paris. He's not the king of Sparta. He's none of these people. He's Homer. So at this point, here in No Second Troy, he is in some imaginative way trying to step back into that role of the person that sings of Helen, rather than the person who gets to be with physically Helen. So it's a marvelous stage that the poem is set on within this cycle, although that kind of disappears as he moves through the enterprise of more generalizing his poems a little later in his career.
Yeah, so it's interesting then. So in some ways, taking seriously that idea, which we'd heard that's come up over time during his relationship with Maud Gunn, always this notion of non-physical relationship, casting it as in terms of previous lives or sort of astral relationships, etc. And I always, my students snicker a lot when I when I talk with them about that. It is interesting, and so it's easy to sort of just sort of dismiss that and be like, well, obviously, if someone's saying to you, I want a mystical relationship, you're like, okay, got it. I'm gonna have to move on here. But Yeats, it sounds like, so this, and of course, this is after the whole terrible situation Gunn had with her husband John McBride.
Yeah.
After this, she was very vulnerable, I think, state after this. And so I think, again, yeah, likely some kind of physical consummation occurred after this. And then her asking for this, the return to the notion of a mystical relationship or whatever, this kind of non-physical relationship, and Yeats sort of taking it seriously and then couching it in terms of a kind of, I guess, occult sort of story. It makes sense. It seems typically Yeatsian. I hadn't known much about this, so can you give us a little bit of background on the elixir of life story itself? I imagine that one recurs, and has many different versions. So maybe just
Mhm.
basics on that.
So there is a story that Nicholas Flamel, who you can visit his house still in Paris. It's now a high-end restaurant. So when we were in Paris for one of the Yates Society meetings, I considered walking by and looking in. But there's, other than the plaque on the wall, there's no real connection anymore. But there's supposed to be this coded message that he leaves for people. Um, and if you poke at the history, it begins to unravel a little, like all of these stories do, but holds together just enough to not be dismissed. That he was a figure who ends up coming into some wealth at some point, but that theoretically he and his wife, through their research in alchemy, learn how to turn base metals into gold, hence the wealth. But also there's the elixir of life, the two great, the great works as they're known,
Right.
which confers immortality, and kind of freezes you in that time. Um, and those of you in the future who are watching this, if this name sounds familiar, yes, this is the guy that is pulled by J.K. Rowling to put into her books as one of the alchemists, and you bump into him. I've only seen the one of the films, but he makes an appearance in the Fantastical Beasts films as the guy that's still there, immortal. But he and his wife, in these original stories, end up in this kind of pure state and pure marriage.
I see.
So Yeats is trying to draw on that when he puts it in the and it, it's really easy to kind of snicker at Yeats, especially at moments like this when he got his research wrong and had to put the little errata into the book saying, "Yeah, it's not Lully, it's Flamel. Sorry, guys." Um, but there is a real sense that he is trying to capture some of that sense with her of saying, yes, this is, it's not just that you're Helen of Troy. You are something really special, and I want us to have this really special thing together. So I think there is a sincerity there, in those feelings that he's having for her and trying to stake out this claim of a higher state, and the astral connections and the mystical marriage and things like that. And since you mentioned McBride, there are a couple of digs at him in this poem, that he's trying to say, okay, we're above that. And
it's an interesting context, and it's different from the one I usually think of, which is more in the terms of her work in politics prior to this period. And it's interesting in the poem, of course, is that she would of late, and it's such a so typically Yeatsian here, this I don't know, this kind of politeness you get in this slightly evasive way of phrasing here, because she wasn't really, after the McBride, her relationship with McBride, everything falls apart. But after, I think, around 1905, she's much less involved, if at all, in politics in Ireland. Certainly not to the degree she had been before. And so that of late, Mick, sort of like, if you don't read it carefully, you think she's there. You're thinking of Maud Gunn still as the person who's all, trying to arrange gun running and that kind of stuff. And so a little sleight of hand there in that first bit. But for me, it's often in that context, and I had not thought of the poem at all in terms of this larger alchemical story in history at
Mhm.
all. But it makes sense. But go ahead a little bit further than with that first question. There's more you want to say about that.
So one note before we leave the metaphysical here, because or rather the cycle of it all, because there's an interesting thing if you go off to Dan Albright's edition of the
Hmm.
poems and look at the dates. Yeats is taking these poems in this cycle of his and rearranging the order of composition,
Mm.
um, so that it becomes kind of a progression, because No Second Troy is written later than Reconciliation, but Reconciliation appears after this. So it sounds like, um, he's here kind of wrestling with the subject matter of No Second Troy, saying, what are we going to do? What was she going to do? What's she going to burn down another city? There's no city worth burning down.
Hmm.
Oh, look, in this next poem, we've reconciled and things are attached and closer.
Hmm.
But if you look at the order of the composition, that's not the order that they were written in,
Yeah, right
or in
here.
some ways final. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, so with this cycle, he's trying to tell some sort of a story,
Mm.
um, arranged after the fact.
Mm.
So it's a similar kind of sleight of hand that you were talking about, where,
Hmm.
of late, well, it wasn't that recent. And you're alluding to the Jubilee riots here, Yates, and those were a while ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and Yates has always been good about this, about taking the past and repackaging it and shaping it to tell, um, to reach for, in some ways, a higher truth,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
he always seems to be trying to chase, of saying, yeah, if in strict chronological order it doesn't happen like this, but, um, and as he's going to say in a vision, he's trying to create, a higher sense of, order and justice.
Hmm.
So we need to rearrange the poems now that we've got the whole story here, and put them in an order that makes more sense within that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because if you kind of track through any person's day, at the end of the day, you can make much more sense of what happened.
Hmm.
Whereas at any moment in that day, it's not going to piece together,
Hmm.
because you don't have the eureka moment until sometime after dinner. But those pieces kind of bounce around in order during the day, and then you can arrange them all and package them up at night. Um, so Yeats is telling that story here.
Yeah, and it's really useful, I think, too, for people who teach aids to think about that in going through the Green Helmet. No Second Troy is a poem that often gets taught in isolation. And it's
Mhm.
really easy to do that in terms of the Helen of Troy mythology. So that's the obvious one that hits you. So you can kind of think about it as this poem sort of in isolation, relating and of course contrasting an earlier age when there was a kind of nobility and something worth cities that were worth burning, and the sort of
Mhm.
the greatness and conflagration and all of that versus this kind of fallen present. And it fits in with a more sort of modernist vision. But it's important, I think, of teaching this poem to teach it in the sequence, as you're stressing, at the start of that volume, the Green Helmet, and to be aware, as we are with, say, the opening of the Tower, that volume where he's also done some careful rearranging, and to
Mhm.
think about the kind of story he's building in there, and then that overlaid with the Elixir of Life story is really really fascinating there. Um, so I think the first question, again, that the referring to the Jubilee riots, the whole sort of history of Maud Gunn's work, on the side of republicanism and physical force nationalism and all of that. But of course, and there's also an element too of class here with the little streets upon the great that, in this time in Yeats's life, getting increasingly fascinated with aristocratic traditions. So then the second part is for me, is always the really fascinating one. And the second question is the one where sort of always like, like what just happened there? Part of it's just for me, the modifiers in this, what is modifying what in this second question, but maybe if you want to talk about that second question, what could have made her peaceful?
One of the things I love about that line is, and he's doing this throughout the entire poem with the enjambment. He starts off with something that you think, all right, he's going in one direction here, which lets you do something that the famous example that I always trot out for my students is when Robert Frost took one of his editors to task about putting in the serial comma at the end of Stopping by Woods and saying, no, it needs to be lovely, comma, dark and deep, so that it can be both three things, lovely, dark and deep, or its loveliness is because it's dark and deep.
Because it's dark and deep,
So so there's that structure here too, because Yeats has been offering Maud Gonne for years a life among the poets and the thinkers where people can appreciate her. That's his big offer. Because as you say with the class thing, Yeats is broke, is spending much of his life here broke, borrowing money to go visit Maud Gonne. And she's independently wealthy. She doesn't have to worry. So you start off with this, what could have made her peaceful with a mind? And there's this instinctive reaction of, what was she going to get with me anyway? Here I am, life of the mind, the poet, and everything else. What could have made her peaceful with that? But then the next line defeats it by making that focus on her. So it's he keeps doing this in this poem, this wonderful shift of, how is she going to be content with the slow moving parliamentary politics that might eventually generate home rule? Why did anyone really expect that of her? Because of, and you get this word here in the middle of that next line that is simultaneously a little problematic, but also incredibly powerful there. Simple. Because, if we had a physicist here, he could talk about, and I say here because got a friend of mine who is, he could talk about the complexities of fire and how it isn't, at one level it's simple, you look at it and it's there burning, but it in this poem it's also nodding forward to, what was simple about burning Troy. It took 10 years, and there was a lot that went into that. So it's pulling it down into something that is purified rather than reduced to something simple-minded.
That's right. And there is a kind of nobility in that sort of poor-mindedness, which ties in with what you were talking about earlier, that sort of the alchemical story, elixir of life. In some ways, I imagine that story, thinking about it as purifying in some ways themselves out of the sort of need for physical contact into a different sort of state. So, and now the other thing about that line that's interesting, what is the causal relationship? So nobleness made simple as fire, with a mind that nobleness made simple as fire. So there seems to be this external nobleness that is separate from the mind, which then somehow purifies the mind and makes it, perfectly simple. And again, in that complex way, not a pejorative notion of simple, but as this kind of quintessence, right? But then it also seems as if nobleness is a property of the mind itself, of her as well. So it's both separate from her and a part of her. And I wonder, I'm not sure what to say about that, but it's one of those moments where I sort of feel like, whoa, there's a really, again, as you were saying at the outset, we read this poem and it's this nice, beautiful little clockwork, and it feels like it works perfectly. And then you start looking at it, you're like, wait a second, that doesn't really make logical sense to me. Nobleness can't be a property of her and a separate characteristic causing something to change within her.
Mhm. Well, you've got here earlier at one of the digs that I was mentioning against McBride, where um, you know she's taught to ignorant men most violent ways, like her husband, who could have hurled the little streets on the great had he but courage equal to desire. Uh, and he is at that time in Dublin the great hero. Now here's this noble figure. He was off in the Boer War, doing these great things, and there is an indirect sense of Yeats saying, "Yeah, Ireland, what has he done for you lately?" And you guys are holding him up to be the big noble figure. Take a look at her. She's the one who's the real noble person here.
Right.
I can't go public with the things that he has done to her and her half sister, but your opinion of him would probably drop if you knew. And so it is the reminder of all of the things that she will record in A Servant of the Queen, that she's the one in the service of Queen Maeve in that book, the ironic title that no, I'm not talking about Victoria here. She's the one in the more noble tradition. She's the one that has had this noblesse oblige sacrifice of her life for Ireland in a way that he is not. So it's that may be some of that external stuff that you're talking about here, the nobleness of her mission and the purity of that mission, and what she's willing to sacrifice and do for it.
Yeah, and both the characters. Yeah, so this kind of greater cause that she is true to in a way that McBride, even though he's so popular, et cetera, is actually not. So there's a nobility in that, in the cause itself, and then there's also a nobility in her in the way that, again, there's a kind of that sort of sprezzatura, that aristocratic sort of idea of there are things going on in her personal life, and yet she does not use those to garner sympathy. She instead remains this kind of pose, this unflappable, and there is a sort of nobility about that, to be able to have this sort of public face when there are so many personal things going on that would garner her sympathy, were people to know about them. So what about the next modifier then? So beauty with beauty like a tightened bow. That takes us back to like in the start of In the Seven Woods, a poem like The Archer. So, and it picks up on the Troy, that idea. But I wonder what you thought about that modifier.
Yeah, and that is one of the ones that echoes both back and forward and within, as you say, the entire concept of the Trojan War, that Titan bow, that whose bow are we talking about here? Are we talking about Paris? Are we talking about Cupid? Are we talking about Apollo, Diana? The list goes on. Artemis within the Greek tradition, but there is this sense of that stance, that moment before that bow is released, and the pent up potential there, that all of that power is contained within that moment. And I know Yeats was not an archer, but there is this moment in archery where once you get it back here, you can hold it. it's getting it all the way back that's the problem. But once it's held, it gets into this pause state,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
where you can hold it for a little bit and then release it, and all the tension flies
Hmm.
out. But it's that restrained power at that moment where, you know, damage is about to be done. Um, in the way that, in some ways, you can go back to the way that Yeats described that, you know, the troubling of his life began
Hmm.
when she walks into the room, that there's that tightened bow,
Hmm.
and him looking back saying, all right, that was the moment when push came to shove and it all began to move forward. um,
Hmm.
and that release that takes place there.
Hmm.
um, and there is, because you never see in great statuary, or very seldom see in the great statuary, the moment after the release.
Hmm.
It's always, you
Yeah.
know, back here.
Yeah.
So it becomes an artistic moment as well.
Hmm. Hmm. There's a
And
certain,
it's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna note there's a sense of power conferred on her in
Mm-hmm.
that state. But it's also there's also a sense that it's not, that it is more, that her beauty itself, this kind of characteristic of her, is the force that is, contained in the Titan bow. So in some ways, it takes away a little bit of the active power of her and renders it into something like an essential property of herself. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think the whole poem, and I mentioned that, I just think the poem does this kind of tension thing, like how much is she responsible versus how much is this power, whatever it is, this power to cause all these things to happen, how much of it is just a characteristic of her, that it's just something that she is, not something that she controls.
Mm-hmm. And it is something that Yeats knows has followed her entire life.
Yeah, yeah.
That that she was seen as one of the great beauties of the age. And there are
Hmm.
these wonderful stories that you can find in the literature where people talk about the two of them appearing places. Like they're wandering through an art gallery discussing the art, and everyone else stops looking at the art and starts looking at them.
Hmm.
Or walking out of the Dublin fog, her with her huge mastiff, the Dagda, and Yeats walking along like the old gods coming out. Um, there is that, but there is that active sense of she has this potential to do all of these things.
Hmm.
Um, so there, while you're right that there is this sense of this is part of her innate quality, um, but that Titan bow could also be aimed at McBride right now,
Yeah,
where she's not releasing it,
right, right.
where it's going back to that nobleness we're talking about,
Yeah,
where
exactly.
she could be more destructive,
That's
um,
right. Yeah.
but restrains, in some ways, restrains herself, and that's part of her beauty.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, Matt, that's really interesting. I not absolutely not thought about it in those terms, but that makes sense to me, because then it helps to explain the next modifier. So if that next phrase is a modifier of her beauty, and I always, puzzle through this, like what is that, a kind, does that refer to her mind, to maybe to nobleness, or to beauty? And if it refers here to beauty, then a lot of what you're saying makes sense, because not natural in an age like this. So in an age like this, in a modern age, if you have this weapon you can use another against another person, if you can put out gossip in the newspapers, kind of thing, that exactly what Yeats hated, you could use it. But her beauty is different from that. She doesn't turn it into a kind of weapon. So it's not natural in an age like this. And it's high and solitary and most stern, which fits back in with that kind of noble performativity, which is like I could get into personal details of my life and this other person, but that would be a kind of I don't know, that would be there would be a coming off of a sort of pose of nobility for one to do that. That there's a sense of propriety here that, of course, then gets back to
Mhm.
the whole aristocratic idea in Yeats.
And also the and this is something that affected both of them tremendously with the everything with Catherine O'Shea
Right.
and Captain O'Shea and everything that did to Parnell.
Yeah.
You've got a very similar kind of situation here. The the disgraceful man is the one being held up in the public eye as being the important, the good, the wronged individual.
Hmm.
Where if you look at O'Shea's Captain O'Shea's background, he's anything but. But he's seen as the wrong man in the downfall of Parnell,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
which Yeats links very tightly with Maud Gonne.
Yeah.
There's the part in the autobiographies of everyone believing she's in mourning over Parnell when she's in mourning over her child.
That's right.
Um,
Which is dressed in black there, and everybody
yeah.
imagines that.
Mhm.
I think that's a really good point, because I think the Parnell, it's hard to overstate how impactful Parnell is on the way Yeats is thinking about Irish history. And I definitely could see an echo of that and a contrast here between um, her behavior and the behavior of other people in the Parnell scandal. And certainly Captain O'Shea, as you're saying, was not was definitely had some real flaws going on there. Um, so we get this next question, and the questions pile up, get rapid fire questions now. Um, why? What could she have done, being what she is? And that's an interesting question, that was sort of like in her essence, as opposed to in her sort of behavior. Um, and so it's getting at that tension as well. Um, but I don't know. What do you think about the way that we build up toward the ending here? And of course, we have the truncated sonnet. We should also mention here the poem's
Yep.
12 lines rather than 14. So we have this. If we're leading up to the sonnet, we expect the closing couplet, but we don't get that. We just get questions.
Yeah, where there should be the answer to all these questions. It's simply not there. The thing that I'm most fascinated about this line, because if you run off to the Variorum edition, which I did yesterday, um, he said, kind of defeating the purpose of running off to it and making himself look intelligent. Um, this is the one line where you get a change, which is the comma, um, where Yeats intentionally is slowing down our reading here, with these caesura within the line. And it's because you get first complicated rhetorical question, second complicated rhetorical question, third rhetorical question that he breaks up, which is going to lead us in the next line to the only simple, straightforward question of the entire poem.
Let me just
Um,
mention for people, by the way, who are not familiar with the Variorum, which is an incredible resource if folks don't know, but it traces out the changes that are made to different published editions of the published versions of the poem. So we can see a change here in later editions, including the comma. So that's what you're talking about here with the Variorum.
yeah, yeah. So it is almost as if he's slowing us down at this moment to hold up her image, saying, what could she have done? And here she is for your inspection, being like this. What else could happen, or what could we expect? Um, and to a degree, what he could expect, because this is part of his reflection on their changing relationship, and her continued role in Irish politics, that he's going to publicly stand by her in all of this. Um, it's it's one of the things. It's easy, as I said, to kind of make fun of Yeats, the way he perhaps takes a little bit too seriously himself at times.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but in public, when they were going into public places and she was being hissed, he was the one standing by her side, trying to glare down um, her critics,
Mm-hmm.
the ones who were looking at her as the woman who was wrong in McBride.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there is this sense, as he slows down here at the end, as he's trying to reduce his own thoughts to something as simple as fire. All right, let's pause a little bit in here and ask this question: what are her other options
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
other than existing as she is here? What are the other options?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this, incidentally, is the line that I was checking in the recording of Yeats's own voice. He surprisingly, in the recordings we have of him, seldom uses the word this, but this and is, or this, because when I pronounce the two, they don't rhyme. But this is the point in which these two words do rhyme in this particular accent.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it's a wonderful, punchy question here at the end, asking you to reflect back on everything before he hits you with that last line and that last question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course, was there another Troy for her to burn? I mean, we get the title gives us a little bit of a sense of what what the answer might be. Of course, no.
Mm-hmm.
And the contrast between a sort of earlier noble age versus this present age, where there are no cities worth burning. There are there's no sort of nobility. Um, there's a kind of dig in there about, of course, well, not so subtle dig about all modern politics and sort of modern ways of behaving, and I guess against John McBride again to some extent. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Also, though, it's really interesting to think about it in terms of what you're saying, their own personal relationship. I mean, how does this line fit in with that sort of his sense of reconcile to anticipate the next poem, reconciliation with her?
It it's a funny moment for him because if there is another Troy for her to burn, then maybe he gets to become Paris,
Yeah, yeah,
where he is the Paris um,
or Helen.
to McBride's King of Sparta and her Helen. But that's not on offer.
Mhm.
There is no second Troy, um, and it is a real sense of, and it consider the cities that are on offer here, because he's living in London, part of empire. She's living in Paris, heart of another empire, and McBride's off in Dublin, the one that, when we were talking about the Jubilee riots, was the place that she was potentially thinking of trying to burn during those moments.
Mhm.
Um, but those aren't there, and they aren't the option for him or for her to have this great moment. And if he doesn't get to be Paris, what does it say also about his option to be Homer? That we should have the big crescendo at the end, and it's not coming for either of us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that it reinforces the idea, though, of a kind of willed nobility here, that they are not in an age that is conducive to the kind of ennobling forces of history, and yet
Mm-hmm.
um Maud still enacting that kind of nobility. So actually really there is a lot of praise for her in this, and it's a poem that, a lot of times the students think about it in terms of more of objectification of women, but and there is, of course, in the poem, but I think there's a kind of there is something really amazing and ennobling about that, to stand in an age where everything is pushing towards banality and more base motives, and standing above that in that high and solitary and sort of stern sort of pose. Yeah, definitely a Nietzschean idea in there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we were saying before. So any final thoughts on the anything you want to wrap up with on the poem?
The the only to go back and to kind of stress my amazement with the way that he keeps setting up something and then immediately undermining it. And
Hmm.
how not only is that within the structure of the poem itself, it's the theme of the poem.
Hmm.
Because, I am going to start telling you about this unbelievable woman who's ready to launch 1,000 ships, and it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not there. So um, it's an amazing, as I was talking about, you watch it tick, and you see how these things interact with one another, and it's just a deceptively simple poem.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. What it is really amazing. I say this every time with these conversations. I just it always they always prompt me to see the poems anew, because I think we harden into our views, and I sort of have a reading of this poem that's much more tied with a kind of endpoint of the mod. It's one of the last poems, when I talk with my students a lot about Maud Gonne, and it sort of seems like a capstone on that. But it's a very complicated poem in its own right. And I think the effects here, and you pointed that out with the enjambment right at the outset, of what we expect, and like building up to expectations and undercutting those expectations continually. And yet, and there seems to be this constant undercutting of the nobility of the age that within which we live, and what's left is the nobility of the sort of pose of the people like Maud Gonne, who can rise above that in this sort of proud and noble and stern and solitary kind of way of being in the face of that. So yeah,
and there's a wonderful kind of a quick note for its future. Um, that concept echoes forward into the Cranberry song Yeats's Grave, where that idea of the constant undermining, is there in that song as well, and just gets lifted and put into the song. So
right. I gotta check that out. I haven't listened to Cranberries a while. I had my Cranberries phase a while ago, so I gotta take a listen again. Well, that was a real pleasure, Matt. I enjoyed talking with you so much. It's interesting with the conversations. We've been doing a lot of later poems. So it's nice to have a chance to go back to one of the earlier ones. It's among the earliest poems I've done in this series, and really reminding us that we tend to think of the later poems as the ones that are really intricate and complicated and esoteric, but it's running all through Yeats, even into some of
yep.
I guess we call these early middle phase poems right now, like No Second Choice. So thanks so much for taking the time. That was a blast. Great way to spend a morning talking about Yeats.
Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
All right, I look forward to seeing you at one of our next conferences. Take care.
You too.